This is the Leadership Podcast, and we study leaders. This is episode 457, featuring Giles Watkins, coach, speaker, and author of The Positive Sleep Book.
Welcome to the Leadership Podcast. Jim and Jan interview leaders who are blazing new trails. They'll read the bestsellers, they study trends, they'll provide thought leadership and the latest research when it comes to inspiring and leading others. They'll get you access to the great leaders of our time and help you learn from the very best. Now your hosts, Jim Vasilopoulos and Jan Rutherford.
Thank you for joining us today. This is Jim Vasilopoulos, founder of Rafty Advisors, and this is the Leadership Podcast.
Hey, everybody. Jan Rutherford, founder of Self-Reliant Leadership. Thanks for making us a part of your day as we study leaders. And Jim and I have a favor to ask. We've got our 500th episode coming up and wondering what you think, what you'd like to see, if it's a Jim and Jan show or if you think we should have a guest or what. So if you've got something, some idea, let us know. It'll be here before you know it. And you can find all past episodes at theleadershippodcast.com. And
Yes.
also, like many of our past episodes, this episode is brought to you by Darley, our sponsor. Their mission supports all our military and first responders with equipment they need to ensure mission success, whether that's a water pump, a drone, or emergency medical supplies. Learn more about this great company and the great people at Darley, supporting our nation's heroes at darley.com. Darley, you serve others, we serve you.
Yes, and today we welcome our wonderful guest, Giles Watkins. He's an author, coach, and speaker who developed insomnia during a 30-year international business career. Having learned to sleep better himself, Giles wrote The Positive Sleep Book to help others get a better night's sleep. Giles, welcome to the show.
Hi there. Good to see you guys.
Yeah. What's not in the public bio? Something interesting about you.
I think I was just touching on it. I'm a keen player of what I believe you call in the US court tennis. You actually have the world champion. I think it's Cameron Riviere, who's an American, and it's called real tennis over here. I've just been playing about 4 years at a fabulous old traditional game that is the precursor to lawn tennis, and is a handicapped game and is indoors. So it's a game that you can keep playing till even older than I am. So yes, that's kind of a recent passion the last 4 or 5 years.
That's pretty awesome. That's cool. You know, today I think one of the reasons why I think we're super interested on this, if you go back to kind of what Darley talks about, says is we're here for mission success. Well, a lot of times mission success, I think, starts with a good night's sleep, right? And so, you know, I grew up in an area, and I think a lot of people did, maybe people still do today, which is, push it harder, I'll sleep when I die. It was almost a badge of honor to be like, I went without sleep, etc. But we've got smarter about that in recent years. We got watches and rings that keep track of our sleep and tell us what we're doing right or wrong. What have we got wrong about sleep?
It's interesting you say, Jim, that we've got smarter. In one sense, we have got smarter because there's greater focus on sleep, and certainly it's sort of paralleled in a way the growth of neuroscience as a topic being studied. I mean, I'm living in Bristol now. 40 years ago, before I went traveling and working around the world, I was a student at the university here, and there was no neuroscience department. Now there's 3 neuroscience professors. And in a way, that development of looking at the brain has tracked the development of research into sleep. So I think we have got smarter in that we have more knowledge. Where I would take issue is, have we got smarter, is that apparently plenty of research shows that we're all sleeping, particularly in the US and the UK, about an hour less on average than we were 50 years ago. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think we've evolved as a species in the last 50 years to sleep an hour less. What's actually happened is, telephones, televisions, the electric light, all these other things that have now, iPhones, etc., other phones are available, that have emerged, and all these distractions that people are using. So I think, yes, we're smarter. In another sense, we're still taking it for granted in other ways. We're still short sleeping in many cases. What outdated thinking are we still holding on to? I think the number one is probably that you can catch up at the weekend. I think the research suggests you can actually physically catch up. So if you're shattered because you've been short sleeping all week, you can actually restore yourself physically and get some of the energy back. But particularly in the second half of the night, when the sleep is probably more targeted things like regeneration of brain cells, the actual re-energizing of the brain, and actually filing the memories from the day before in a way that helps you learn from those memories, but also sometimes dampens down some of the emotions. Suppose you didn't know a kettle was hot, right? You boil a kettle, you put your hand on it, it hurts a lot. That night, as part of your learning, you'll sort of come up with a new version of the operating system that teaches you, don't do that, it hurts, and will actually also probably, dampen the memory a little bit of the pain. So every night we are absorbing that. So when you short sleep in the week and catch up the weekend, physically recover, but don't get those sorts of mental benefits. And so I think very few people hold on to the view now, though, that sleep is a waste of time. I think we've got over that. And that's partly through sports people talking more and more about sleep as a form of recovery and rest and its importance and so forth. So actually, that profiling around sleep through sports discussions has helped hugely on that.
Yeah. I'm curious. A friend of mine read a book on animals and animals dreaming and, consciousness and trying to explore consciousness. It was a fascinating book. And in that book, clearly, if anyone's got a dog, animals dream. But it went into really deep study of animals and how they dream and the fact that they recall things and actually play back things in their dreams, especially with rats. Some terrible experiments they did, but they did these experiments where they play back the path they went through the maze and that they actually played back the paths that were successful, the paths that were unsuccessful. So it really goes hand in hand with what you're talking about with regard to remembering what you do. But then it did one other thing is it actually found that the rats dreamt about paths they never took. And so there was a level of imagination, a level of kind of creation that was really interesting in that study as well that, I thought was just kind of fascinating in a way. And, I don't know if we can draw anything from that, but I just thought that to me, as we were preparing for this and I had read that book after your book, and then while preparing for this, I thought, wow, that's just fascinating. I mean, sleep is important to animals as much as it is to humans. It affects their
Yeah.
performance.
And I think dreams, interesting you pick up on dreams, Jim, because it really is the next frontier, I would think, of sleep research. There seems to be evidence that stuff is going on that matters, which is exactly to your point with the animal example, and that there seems an emerging consensus that it's beneficial to mental health that we dream, and that some form of learning, restoration, creativity is going on during that phase. But much more than that, I certainly haven't read, or it hasn't been widely publicized as to what's going on, I would say. So
Yeah. And Giles, in the second part of your book, you basically pose the question, what is sleep? And tied to Jim's question about dreams, you've got one of the subsections is sleep and cognition. And, I wonder if you can kind of, for our audience, define briefly how you see sleep and how it ties into cognition and kind of what we're talking
sure,
about here.
happy to do so. Yeah. I mean, I still think, although I read this and I put this in the first edition, which came out in 2019, I used this definition from the Harvard Medical School. It's still the best definition I've seen of sleep because it's very precise. It says, and I'll read it if I may, a phase of the day which where activity, drops right down compared to the balance of the 24 hours within the day. It's associated with a habitual posture. In the case of humans, this is typically lying down with eyes closed. When we sleep, we are less reactive to external stimuli. And unlike hibernation and being in a coma, we can reverse the state of sleep relatively easily. So we can snap out of it quite sharp. So those are 4 key characteristics that would define sleep. When you then link that through to questions around cognition, and just bear in mind, I could have sort of made this point at the beginning. Everything I'm going to share is my understanding of the latest consensus, if you like, on the science, because sleep science is only about 100 years old, the modern study, if you like. So there's still a fair amount of debate, and I think possibly increasing debate about certain things rather than reducing debate in many ways. But what typically happens with the brain when we sleep, and there are some scientists that will tell you the primary reason why we sleep is because of the brain, is that three things happen. One is we restore the brain, like I mentioned earlier. Two is we file these memories. And the thirdly, we actually generate new brain cells. Now, I formed a view as a child that you got like 50 billion brain cells when you started out, and that was your lot, and you were kind of drawing on them as you aged. But apparently, no, we can generate new brain cells. So from a cognitive point of view, that's the key. Those are sort of three key benefits of good sleep. And clearly, you can imagine if you don't get the right quality and quantity, what effect that has on your audience, right? The leadership audience.
I'm wondering, again, those are all reinforcing things that I know, I've been in the articles and press lately. And there's two things that are coming in my mind, and they're kind of disjointed. One is it's interesting, the marine mammals, can shut off one side of their brain and then continue to bob and breathe and not drown. But the other thing that I'm thinking about, again, as mammals, is from an evolutionary perspective. My guess is 20,000 years ago, we did not sleep 7, 8 hours a night. We didn't sleep through the night. I can't imagine. I've been in the woods a lot. I've rarely had a good night's sleep in the woods because you're kind of hyper vigilant. And again, I'm wondering if any of your research really looked at how we were 20,000 years ago. Did we take lots of naps? And, we didn't sleep necessarily 7, 8 hours straight. I'm just wondering, because again, we were talking about evolution. I just wonder how sleep's evolved, if you know.
Yeah, there was a book published a few months ago called something like Sleep Like a Stone Man that went into this kind of detail. A couple of themes that I've certainly picked up from reading about that book and all other research is typically, certainly in sort of Shakespeare's time, everyone seemed to sleep. There were two sleeps. And people in literature actually write about the first sleep and the second sleep in certain books and so forth. So that seems to be reasonably well accepted. And why might that be? Well, people would probably go to sleep and when it got dark and then not sleep the whole night, sleep a few hours, say 3 hours, two sleep cycles 90 minutes, get up and do other things by candlelight and then go back to bed a bit more. So I think the idea of the one long sleep is a kind of post-industrial, as far as I can gather, a kind of post-industrial idea because it fits in with running the factory and all those other things. So I think on that point, Jan, it makes complete sense.
Yeah.
And obviously, if you look at Southern European cultures, particularly Southern Greece and Spain and so forth, they've always been people who sleep slightly shorter nights and have the full couple of hour and a half siesta in the afternoon. So in my experience, certainly I've noticed that if I short sleep, having a strategic nap the following afternoon, typically finishing by 3 p.m. if I possibly can, because if I sleep, say, at 5 p.m. rather than 2 p.m., I'll often struggle a bit with my night's sleep. Makes sense. So I think you're right. I think that the mono sleep, I think it's called, the mono sleep idea is pretty much a post-industrial idea. And I do think that generally, from what I can see in my own personal experience, broken sleep, so long as you get enough of it, is not too much of a problem. And I actually think when I'm working with people one-to-one, which I do a bit of, I do mostly work with leadership groups, but if I do some one-to-one sleep coaching, sometimes the mere fact we have a conversation that says it's normal to wake up in the middle of the night and maybe get up for an hour and do something else and go back to bed is really helpful. It sort of reduces the stress that some people are feeling around their sleep. Oh, actually, that's okay. As long as I'm still getting the length and depth and quality of sleep I feel I need, I still feel rested. I just have to allow for the fact that I might get up at 3 a.m. for an hour and fold some shirts and do a bit of ironing and put the dog out briefly and read a book or whatever I have to do, so that's okay, I think.
Now,
Yep.
what's so interesting is it seems to be, yes, there's some general themes like about the amount of sleep we need, et cetera. And as we mentioned earlier, there's more data that we have that we can gather individually about our sleep patterns and cycles. But is you're trying to establish, like, say, what you need. And I've met people in my life that are like, I only sleep like 2 hours a night and stuff like this, and they function. And, you know, we all have to develop what is our personal recipe for like what works for us. And we know that that doesn't even stay the same through our life, or I don't believe it does. Help us understand how sleep might change, or sleep needs or patterns change as we age through our working years. And then what are the factors that determine, let's say, like quality sleep or good sleep is what we need? Because I think sometimes, we're operating on these generalistic assumptions that maybe don't apply to everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like everything. The more you study a subject, the more you can see the differences probably than the similarities, I suspect. And I suspect that's the same with sleep. As we become even more knowledgeable on the subject, there'll be more nuances and more color, if you like,
Mhm.
brought to the subject. Typically, we do seem to need a little bit less sleep as we get older. Not dramatic, but, it's some minutes or tens of minutes that we might reduce. Just as we also often feel we need a little bit less sleep in the summer rather than the winter. And that's often linked to the circadian rhythm and circadian clock just slightly adjusting because of the amount of daylight versus the dark. When it comes to sleep, I think the amount we need, just quickly in general, that's, I think, going to be almost a bit of a battleground between the old school academics, the guys who've been studying this for 20, 30, 40 years, and the circadian rhythm professors or something like that, who have a certain view around typically the 7 to 8 hour rule, and people who need less than 6 are only about 3% of the population, ditto for, say, more than 10. And if you're in either of those extremes, and a lot of people think they are, and they're not really. Sometimes they're just not sleeping enough. At the other extreme, they may be actually not very well,
Mm.
and as a result, need a lot more recovery time than normal. You might need some medical support. But there's another view, which is brought about by you mentioned Aura rings and some of the digital applications at the beginning, Jim. I mean, there's been quite a lot of publicity recently, certainly in the UK, around the Whoop data from that particular application, saying that core time to sleep is 10 till 4, and anything beyond that's a bonus. But if you're not sleeping 10 till 4, for say 25 consecutive nights, certain things can start to happen. Now, it's just another view. It's just a good example of the lack of consensus around the subject, really, that we all have to listen to, I think, and go, okay, so what seems to work for me? And what seems to work for me, talking to Giles Watkins, is sort of 10 to 5:30, 10 to 6, just before 10 till 5, that kind of window seems to feel about right. It's a bit early for some, I know. I'm definitely in what you'd call the lark category. And that works for me. And I know that if I get that and I get onto that sort of cycle and rhythm, I'm at my best.
Yeah.
So I think, yes, genetics do affect our cycle, whether we might be a lark or an owl or something in the middle. And environment certainly does affect it as well. That can influence what we do and how we do it. For example, I was brought up by parents who like to nap at the weekend. I've inherited that habit. Apparently, it's a function, again, of genetics and environment. Some people are genetically wired so they just cannot nap. You'll meet people who say, I can't take a nap. It ruined. Or others who say, if I take a nap for too long, I get up very groggy and so forth. And then there's others that say, if I have a 20-minute rat nap at 2:30 and I've got a spreadsheet to look at 3 p.m., it's the panacea. It's magic. I can really get back and fire on, and it's my analytical best at that time. So that is a rather rambling answer, I have to say, to your question. However, it is an imprecise terrain, I would say. And the key for anyone, if you're thinking about it as a leader and you're thinking about your team and so forth, it's great to have a conversation about sleep because it's one of their key resources and what sort of person they are and, what matters to them. Because so many leaders assume that all their team are exactly like them. So all their team love a breakfast meeting, or all their team would not mind to get an email at 9:30 at night and then be asked to jump on and do this analysis for an hour or something like that. And you get that an awful lot, and that's just not true.
Yeah. This is fascinating discussion. And I love the fact it's imprecise, because that's something we're all trying to figure out. I know Jan wants to dig in a little bit deeper on that last topic you touched on, but before we do that, I wanted to let everyone know that the U.S. military uses equipment from this family owned business in America's Midwest. And that is our podcast sponsor, Darley. It's an amazing company with wonderful people, and they support first responders, law enforcement, and the military around the globe. Learn more about them at darley.com. That's DARLEY.com.
And Jim, one thing about our sponsor, I was thinking about this, the reason that they sponsor the leadership podcast is because people development, leadership, and what they try to do in their community and in their company is so important. And I was thinking about one of our past guests, Dan Pink, who talked about the things that motivate people: autonomy, purpose, and mastery, the growth and development of people. So the fact that they sponsor this because they're interested in the growth and development means they're really interested in what motivates the people at Darley, their clients, their customers, and the community. So again, we're really grateful for that. So I just wanted to, kind of connect the dots, if you will.
100%.
So Giles, Jim mentioned our sponsor in the military. I was in the military, and if I think about the worst experience of the military for me, literally was sleep deprivation. I did not do well. And there was a lot of people that did. They could go 24, 36, 48 hours and they seemed like they were good to go. I got migraines. I just felt like garbage when I was sleep deprived. I even remember falling asleep in the snow, walking face down. I mean, I literally, I was hallucinating and then I fell face down. Then I got up. But, what I'm seeing right now with some companies is they're like, you know what we're going to do? We're going to put pods in, so people can take naps. And we've had some people say, well, that's not the solution. The solution is, and I've heard this a lot lately, is people are tired. People are really tired. And I've seen clients that have said, how are we going to deal with overtime? And, there are companies out there where people are working not all the time, but sometimes 50, 60, 70 hours a week, especially in construction and manufacturing and different things like that. What's your counsel for people listening, thinking, well, people can suck it up and they can do this temporarily? What guidance do you have for those leaders that think, hey, I could deal with this sleep deprivation. Everybody else should be able to deal with it. Suck it up.
What's my guidance? It's not sustainable to expect everyone to behave like that. There are certain people that make that life choice. And if they've chosen to do that, well, that's their choice. And at certain stages in my career, I did make that choice as well, I would say. I prioritized work over other things. However, I don't think it's sustainable long term. And especially if you get into the area of people doing shift work as well, if you layer that on top, there's no research that shows that works, in terms of your body, because you're essentially introducing a form of social jet lag. You're actually introducing jet lag into your life without taking the blood. So I think it is unsustainable, and it is most likely to reduce the quality of the work that you're getting, and it's most likely to produce fatigued and demotivated employees, which surely isn't good for you in the longer term.
Yeah. What I think of is there's a diminishing point of return, for human performance, whether somebody's an athlete or an executive. There's a certain point where we've got to recognize that. I mentioned Dan Pink earlier. He also wrote a book called When, and it was all about the
I like
science of
that book.
time management and, when to do different things and, when to be creative, when to be analytical. I was talking to my nephew yesterday and he's like, Hey, it's 4:45. I just wrapped up with my admin stuff because I'm brain dead at 4 o'clock. And that's a good time to do admin, busy stuff.
Terrible time to have surgery based on that book.
Yeah.
You don't want
Oh, yeah.
surgery in the afternoon.
Yeah. You want first thing.
Yeah.
It's a bit like the research that shows you don't want to appear before a judge the Monday after the clocks go forward.
Well,
So there's daylight savings in some places is coming up soon, and or the other way around, it springs
Yeah.
forward.
Or a judge in Ireland on May 18th.
March.
March 18th.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, you're quite right.
Well, it's interesting because here I am. It's earlier in the morning where I am. So I'm having my coffee, which is part of my routine. And here you are, Giles, in the UK, probably sipping some tea because that's part of your routine.
Post lunch, yeah.
Yeah. And so that's part of my wake up routine. This is important to me. I need my caffeine. But then we've got people who in the US are drinking energy drinks that are ridiculous and scarfing down things like 5 Hour Energy and, just probably pretty unhealthy stuff for your body. But that's how people maybe in the US cope. But people around the world cope differently with sleep and they deal with it differently. You've traveled all over, you've lived all over. How do people in different parts of the world, do we all view sleep the same, or are there different perceptions and realities about like how we culturally approach sleep?
Oh, yeah, very different. Yeah, I remember my first overseas, I was lucky in my career so far. I've lived in 7 different places and I've 7 different countries, and I've sort of worked at least a day in about 70. So I've been very fortunate to dip into lots of places around the world. And my first proper overseas posting was to Ho Chi Minh City, Saigon, in 1995 to help reestablish an oil company in the city and set up a joint venture. And I was completely horrified that my sales and marketing team would go out for lunch at 12, come back about 20 past, and literally get under the desk and sleep for half an hour. I'd never seen anything like this. I was from the have a sandwich at the desk culture, right?
Yeah.
So I didn't need to stop for lunch. I thought, well, lunch, it wasn't quite lunches for wimps, but it was a little bit like that in my head. And of course, I've just arrived. I've just flown in first, sales and marketing role in a JV that's just about to set up, and it's like your big opportunity, big career move, flying around the world to do it. And they're coming back and they're going to sleep at lunchtime. Like, what is this? However, of course, I learned that if you think they got up really early, they'd had breakfast quite early, it is a very hot climate. The air conditioning in the office was nice and cool. They go out for lunch in the baking hot heat for 20 minutes, sit in a little roadside cafe, coming back having a nap, and they were better for it. There was no question about it. So I wouldn't say I joined them by the end of the 4 years I was there, but I got to understand it. So that was one example, and you see that quite a lot. Of course, I worked also later on with colleagues in Houston a lot, who seemed to get up before they'd gone to bed, as far as I could see. Incredibly early risers, these guys, and beating the traffic to get into the office and by 6:30 or whatever. So yeah, there's a big difference. And I think it's just, and I remember when working in, with multinationals, when they started to globalize, what was 20 plus years ago, there was a mantra around global where you can be, local where you have to be. In other words, we'll globalize everything, but we'll do the odd things on a local basis if we really think we have to because of certain cultural nuances, or it really won't sell there because that brand means something rude or something like that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, actually, I think with sleep, in many ways, it's local where you can be, global where you have to be. In other words, actually, it's around working with each team and finding out what's right for them. And I know I was talking to someone on doing a sleep clinic last week that's working with a global energy. It's a company that's helping store wind power and so forth, and finding ways to charge batteries from renewable energy sources. And they have moved, based in the US, and they've got people right across to Australia, and they've moved away from global team meetings to kind of at least having 2, because they just realized it's too big a time stretch. I ran a global team from London at one stage, and I'd have people joining from Houston at 7, and we'd be 1 p.m. in London, and people joining at close to midnight in Melbourne and someone fell asleep on the call and we could hear her snoring. So, which was, which was a bit embarrassing for her, but completely understandable
Yeah.
because she shouldn't have been on the call, really. So, we shouldn't have been asking her to be on the call. So, I do think it's just sensible to find out, to think about it, but also to, as we did when I worked in McKinsey, it's an organization that gets its fair share of critics. But one thing it certainly in my day really got right is when you started working on a project, which often would go for several months, and often you'd be with the same 4 or 5 people on that particular work stream. You'd have a kickoff meeting in the first couple of days and you'd talk about whether you were a lark or an owl and when did you take exercise, and if so, when did you? And if you wanted to have an evening meal, if you're working late, do we break at 6 or 7? Or, and if we work with Muslims as well, going through Ramadan, you'd have to factor that in and all these things. And it's just treating your supposedly most valuable resource, the person, as a person.
Yeah.
Uh, it's Yet it seems like a lot of leaders find that surprisingly difficult to do, which is bemusing, really, if people really want to carry through on the mantra around people being our most important asset, which so many companies say it is.
Yeah. And I think it's so challenging now because we've got people who have, development teams in India. And so they have these handoff meetings at late in the night if you're in the US, and early morning meetings to find out what happened the next day. And it's wonderful that we have this international economy. At the same time, it makes things so terribly challenging for people who are trying to kind of coordinate. And we all know that, yeah, we can do things via email and read emails in the morning, but like face to face communications, even if it's via Zoom or something like this, are just so much more powerful. And so those interactions, as we stretch people to the limits of what their acceptable kind of time barriers and sleep needs are we really getting the best out of our people if we go that direction?
Yeah. Just have to give it some thought. I know one of the guys I was talking to who's part of that renewable energy organization said he's been able to say, I think it's 6 till 8 are my golden hours in the evening. I'm going to go and have a meal, do some sport, whatever it is. Please don't contact me during that. And I will rejoin at 8 for up to another 2 hours if required, but I need that time. And fortunately, his leadership team's gone, that's a completely reasonable request. We'll do that, So I think we sort of also going to touch on a little bit around that. What's the responsibility of the company and what's the responsibility of the individual? Well, that's a good example of an individual coming forward and feeling empowered and feeling that they can say, that's what I need. And I think post-COVID, certainly in this country, I can't speak for others because I've not worked abroad so much in the last 5 years, but I've certainly seen in the UK, employees being, especially the younger generation, the sort of 20 to 40-year-olds, being more prepared to say, look, hang on, I need this time off, or I need that, or if we can structure things in this way, you'll get a better performance from me, which is just got to be healthy, really.
Yeah.
I'm not speaking for Jim. Maybe I am. That more than a few times a week, I will say, I'm not a psychologist, therapist, marriage counselor, but as an executive coach, a majority of the people that I work with, I think Jim as well, are people that have kids. And we will often get advice about, well, hey, when your kids were this age, what did you do? I'm wondering, again, a lot of people listening are parents and raising kids at home. Any advice for the parents to develop good sleep habits in their kids and role model those things? Because again, as we know, if people aren't doing well at home, it's really hard for them to perform at work.
I do think there's a value in the really old-fashioned way of a wind-down technique for children, taking it in turns if you can, to sort of bath them at the end of the day and have some hot milk or whatever it is they like to have before they go to bed, and read a story and play some music and all those kind of things, all the kind of the traditional way of, certainly my generation probably was put to bed by parents. I think that's a very healthy way, and equally in the morning to have a wake up that is electronic free for a bit, preferably, either using sunrise alarm clocks or other alarm clocks, or just the children not having an alarm clock and the parents going and wake them up for school. And so I think those can be really good habits. And what I see with people in their 20s and 30s that come to me for sleep advice is they'll often say, I slept really well and I had a really good rhythm until I went to university. And then I left home and it went out the window and I've never quite got it back. And actually, what you find as people get older is they're sort of trying to get back into that habit of what's my evening routine that I had when I was a 6-year-old, but not the same routine. It'll be, 9 p.m. or I don't know, I'll make some chamomile tea and I'll have a bit of magnesium because that'll relax me a bit. And I'll take the dog for a quick walk around the block because that's a nice way to end the day if it's not raining, and maybe put the bins out and I'll put some nice relaxing music on, or, and I'll read a few pages of a novel I love because it's a nice way to end the day. Those sorts of wind down things that an adult would do, are not the same as what a child would do, obviously. But I think those actually are great habits to help your children get into and great habits to model yourself. And I've sort of gone back to that, I think, a bit. And I was definitely when I was 18, it all went out the window, school. So,
hmm Yeah. It's interesting, Jan. Earlier you said like you never get good sleep when you're out in the wilderness.
yeah.
And I agree with that. You never get a good night's sleep, except for the one night we went up that glacier in Patagonia. Boy, did I sleep like a baby that night.
You were so tired.
I was exhausted. I was thinking about that earlier. I'm like, wow, that was one of the best
Yeah.
night's sleep I ever had.
I don't know how many nights I've slept out in the wilderness, but I can only honestly, I can only remember one night where I woke up and went, I slept through the night. I mean, one time. And gosh, I don't know how many. I've spent more than a few years, I'm sure, sleeping on the ground of my life. But I just think, it's just interesting. Again, I think it's easy to sleep when you're not worried about anything. And I think it's hard to sleep no matter, whether you're worried about, a bear messing with your tent, or you're worried about, the CFO yelling at you in the morning.
Yeah, sure. It's relaxing the body and quieting the mind are the two key things, really, you're looking to do. And all those things you've just mentioned are things that might cause you to be less relaxed or for the mind to race.
Yep.
So anything you can do to get into a mode that is more relaxed and where there's a general sort of winding down. The French, I can't remember the exact French phrase for it, but they have an expression that translates as the bicycle in your head. And I think what you've got to do is try and get off the bicycle and get the wheels to stop.
Oh, I like that one.
I like that a lot. I like that. Giles, this has been really fascinating. And, this is one of those topics. It seems like it's kind of disconnected from leadership, but it's so connected to leadership. It's so relevant. Do you have any closing thoughts for our listeners as we wrap up today?
Yeah, just to say that, look, I was someone who had 12 years of insomnia problems that gradually got worse and worse. And a couple of things happened that prompted me to take it seriously. And over a period of about 6 months, I started to get hold of the issue by trying various things. And having worked with people, particularly over the last 5 or 6 years, and writing a book and having my sort of side hustle become my main hustle, what have I learned? I've learned that 80% of people with a sleep problem can do something about it.
Yeah.
20% probably can, but it may require medical or therapeutic support. But of the people that come to see me, I would say at least 8 out of 10, I feel, can genuinely improve if they make some behavioral changes, if they really want to enough. And that's what I try and enable. So if you're out there and you're struggling with your sleep, it's worth either grabbing the book or look at some of the other resources that are around and start to think about, well, what could I change? And because most people get it quite quickly. They think, oh yeah, in fairness, if I stop using the mobile phone at 3 minutes to 12, it might help. Or
Yep.
if I stop having that large glass of whiskey at 11 o'clock at night, it's a sedative and it'll knock me out, but it won't keep me asleep all night, etc. So a lot of people know, if they really think about it, the habits that are stopping them sleep. And then it's a question of how important it is to them, like anything around change. How much
Yeah.
does it matter to you?
Yeah. And the book is The Positive Sleep Book, a holistic approach to resolve sleep issues and transform your life. And as always, we'll list that book in our show notes. And We appreciate Giles being on the show this week. And of course, we'll include other ways you can connect with him at theleadershippodcast.com. And remember, sleep is that golden chain that ties health and our bodies together. Thomas Dekker.
Thanks for listening to the Leadership Podcast. To listen to more shows or to access the books and content discussed on this show, be sure to visit theleadershippodcast.com. The material in this podcast is copyright by Rafti Advisors and Self-Reliant Leadership and must have written approval before commercial application.